be looking at Philippians chapter 2 today, just a little bit. I'll read this first, and then I have quite a bit to say. We'll get into that in a moment. Philippians chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. If you find any comfort from being in the anointed, if his love brings you some encouragement, if you experience true companionship with the Spirit, if his tenderness and mercy fill your hearts, then brothers and sisters, here is one thing that would complete my joy. Come together as one in mind and spirit and purpose, sharing in the same love. Don't let selfishness and prideful agendas take over. Embrace true humility and lift your heads to extend love to others. Get beyond yourselves in protecting your own interests. Be sincere and secure your neighbor's interests first. In other words, adopt the mindset of Jesus the Anointed. Live with his attitude in your hearts. So, Thornton mentioned that my wife and I moved here just about a month ago. In fact, beginning of August. Natalie is a physician at a private group, Nested in Memorial. She's a pathologist by trade, quite amazing. And we're here because she has this amazing opportunity. I have been a pastor in the past, coming out of serving a small congregation just south of Omaha, Nebraska, which is where I was born and raised. And we've traveled around a little bit, but that's where I'm coming from. And right now, I am a stay-at-home parent. And we're looking at what is kind of a perfect storm for you all at the moment. That I'm a pastor who hasn't had a pulpit in over 6 weeks. And I spend my days with a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. So I get to talk to adults, and nobody's going to interrupt me. We might be here until past noon, just because I get to talk to grown-ups for the first time in a long time. Our children are fantastic. Lainey is our 7-year-old, soon to be 8-year-old. She's a second grader at GES. She's all sorts of fantastic. She's wearing a very vibrant skirt this morning, which is an apt description of her. She is a wonderfully vibrant child. Hallie is our middle child. She is wonderfully enigmatic. She has this beautiful passion deep inside, but she's got this protective barrier around her that she's a little nervous. But man, once you're inside of those boundaries, she is a delight. And then CJ is the little ruckus rolling around with the mohawk. He is also quite fantastic, but a little bit of stranger danger these days. And we're going through all sorts of transitions. This is the first big move for the kids as a family, so we're in this transition. And it's a joy to be with you. I had mentioned that I was in a congregation just south of Omaha. If I was there this morning, and not because it's comparison, but when you're born in Nebraska, you're taught to be a Cornhusker fan. That's just what life is. And now that they all have jumped ship to the Big Ten, you all know a little bit about how they can be as fans. And today would be the one day that I would stand up in front of them and I would say, I'm sure you all saw the score yesterday. Kansas football, which is my alma mater, and Kansas is terrible at football, we won yesterday. And I would patronize them by saying, hey, look, the Jayhawks are amazing, aren't they? But I've been told I'm not supposed to mention the Jayhawks here because some people are still upset about Bill Self. We're going to work through that together. That's part of our second hour this morning. It's going to be just fine. And really my hope as we spend time in congregations is that we're given permission to wrestle with what Scripture has in front of us. I really think the biggest challenge facing us as a church is a lot of people just put in the time and we're not necessarily given permission to ask the questions, to do the kind of things that might be frustrating or uncomfortable, and we're not certain if the person next to us has the same question that we do, so most of us are afraid to ask. So part of my understanding as pastor is to create some of that stress, some of that tension for everybody, so that as we get to Scripture, we've got something to hold on to. As we wrestle with breaking a few things down, as we're building ourselves back up in Scripture, we can find what God has for us and not just, oh, I've heard that passage before, it's going to be okay. And I had this, because again, I had all of this time to think with the little ones. I had this really exciting thing I was going to talk about with Colin Kaepernick, the quarterback of the 49ers, who's maybe created a few waves by not standing during the national anthem. And I don't know if you have these friends or not, but there are some friends that are applauding him and lifting him up as he is a wonderful mouthpiece. And there are those that are not lifting him up and trying to do as much as they can to put him down, saying that he is a national travesty. And if you've got friends that are on both sides, sometimes you're stuck in the middle, or maybe you're on one side or the other, and it feels hard to figure out how to engage in any kind of dialogue with somebody that's not like-minded. I mean, how do you have a conversation when we don't start with the same vocabulary or the same tools? What does it look like when we do that? And I was very excited to do this. And then Nebraska had to go and do something yesterday that really melted my heart. And Nebraska had a starting punter who was poised to be an All-American this season. He had done really well, and he and another gentleman were killed in a car accident this summer. And yesterday during Nebraska's football game, during their first punting situation, they only sent 10 men onto the field. They left the punter's spot open for Sam Foltz, so that way the entire community could come and say, here is our collective moment of silence for the loss that we all feel. And it was one of those moments where I thought, in that moment, sports and community and the other things kind of fade away, and we get an opportunity to experience something together. And I thought, well, that makes much more sense, especially because Jim has been talking to you all about community for the last month. I mean, he started out at the beginning of August talking about the specialness of CPC, the way you do what you do. And in an amazing way, in a gift that Jim has for you all, he stood up there and he pointed and named a name and pointed and named a name and pointed. And he's got your pulse. He understands what makes you all tick. And he's doing this really beautiful thing to help you become the best version of CPC that you can be. And then the following week, he said, while those are good things, it's not just about here, but we've got to turn and focus outward. It's how you go and live your faith in the world that helps define the kind of community that CPC is. It's not about what you bring in, but it's about the gifts that you take to the world and how your particular passions take you to your workplace, how they take you to the mission field, how they take you back to your homes and families, and beyond just a community of faith. And along with that, he talked about the gifts that you bring as well. He used 1 Corinthians 12, and that we all have a specific gift, and it's when we get our gifts all together that we start to understand the fuller picture of who God is and what Christ has in store, and the uniqueness and particularity about this community. And then last week, he kind of tied it all together with love, talking about how love becomes the transformative element of community, that not only is this community transformed by the love of Christ that we have for one another, but the way that that transforms and sends us out into the world. And one of my first Sundays that I was here, I mentioned to Jim that I was a pastor and that while there aren't any available congregations, I'm also not really interested in just going to any church. There are a lot of bad churches out there, and it doesn't matter what kind of a pastor you are. Some churches just aren't healthy places to be. So it makes it great for Natalie and I to be able to worship with you all. But I mentioned to him that I'd be interested in, if he's ever gone, fill in the pulpit. That's one of the fancy things we Presbyterians do. And he said, well, what do you want to talk about? I said, well, let's keep talking about community, because there is this incredible gift that we've been given. And as an outsider or fence straddler or somebody that's kind of new in the mix, it's kind of a joy to talk about what community here looks like as one who is beginning to taste and experience and understand what that looks like, but then also be able to speak into it something that might be a little different. Because really, while it's easy to strip the identity of being Presbyterian, I mean, most of us, I joke, we don't lead with being Presbyterian. Most people don't applaud for Presbyterian pastors. And that's probably a safe thing. But one of the things that makes us unique is the way that we've prioritized community in our theology that we say we've been designed to be in these relationships with each other. That's why when Jim talks about the work of the session and the work of the committees and how hard each of the individuals are doing for the collective, that's why it's important, because we're identifying, here's who we are theologically. And it's important as well because when we start to engage Scripture, it gives us the freedom to have differing opinions and then to talk with one another about how we experience Scripture because of the unique set of circumstances that our lives have brought us through. So when we read something, we can say, well, this is what I understand it to say. And when somebody else reads it, they can say, well, here's how I understand it. And Scripture invites us into this dialogue. So community becomes essential for our understanding of who God is. Because if we're only living a private or personal faith, the rest of us are missing out. It's when we live our faith in community that we begin to get the fuller picture of who God is. So we're going to read a little in Paul's letter to the Philippians today. That's kind of where we're going to land for our time. And Paul was this amazing missionary. The quick synopsis is Paul was not one of the original disciples. He encountered Jesus on the road to Damascus. In fact, Paul was the primary persecutor of Christians. He was on his way to oversee an execution when he encountered Christ. And then he became the leading advocate for Christianity. He became the ambassador of Christianity to the Gentiles. He became the ambassador between the Gentiles and the Jews as this bridge of faith was being created through Christ. And he wrote a bunch of letters. As he had been planting churches, he stayed in communication and would try and address some of the specific issues. But because they didn't have email or Twitter, or because they weren't, I don't know. I don't go beyond that, email and Twitter. Facebook, Instagram. My mind is going to places that it shouldn't in terms of other social media that I've heard of, but I'm just going to make up names and not sound like I know what I'm talking about. But Paul would send these letters, and then the letters would be sent to the other churches as well. They would say, well, we know that this may not be your primary concern. However, this isn't something that you can address with your community. So Paul was sending this letter to the church of Philippi, and Paul was a brilliant rhetorician. Paul crafted these beautiful, exquisite arguments. Listen to how he starts just in verse 1. And he's just laying it on thick. If you find any comfort from being in the anointed, if his love brings you some encouragement, if you experience true companionship with the Spirit, if his tenderness and mercy fill your hearts, my goodness. I mean, that's everybody, right? I mean, that's a lot of ifs. If there's anything that stirs your soul, if you get caught up in this story at all, if you believe in what's going on, if God has done something, I mean, he's basically looking into the congregation gathered and saying, all right, I got them covered, I got them covered. Okay, whew, everybody's here. And then he says, brothers and sisters, here is one thing that would complete my joy. Now, that's also some hyperbole as well. Because there's no way Paul, this brilliant understanding of what faith is looking like in the real world, believes one thing is going to actually change or fix or address all that's going on. But he said here, one thing that would complete my joy. Come together in one mind and spirit and purpose, sharing in the same love. All right. I mean, this right there is as good of a church mission statement, vision statement, purpose statement as you can have. Coming together in one mind, spirit, and purpose, sharing in the same love. And we can all nod our heads like we've been taught to do in church. Like, yeah, that sounds like the right kinds of stuff. Yeah, that feels good. But there's an itch in the back of our mind that says, which mind, which spirit, which purpose, which love? Because we're just one flavor of Christianity that's gathering for one particular amount of time on a Sunday morning, while there are a handful of others that are gathering across the city, and even more that are gathering across the nation, and some of them will play with a beautiful set of instruments. Some of them will play with a fantastic organ. Some of them will have no music at all. Some of them will really let a pastor preach for an hour and a half. Which one? I mean, is it the one that are demonizing people for sharing opinions? Is it those that are celebrating those for offering their opinions? I mean, how do we decide which mind and which purpose and which spirit, which version of love? Is it the tough love that caves in, that doesn't cave in? Is it the graceful love that says, you know what, I know it's been a bad day, so we're just going to forget the rules for a moment and we'll let you stay up a little bit later? And then Paul starts to make a little bit more sense. Don't let selfishness or prideful agendas take over. Embrace true humility and lift your heads as to extend love to others. Okay, so I think we can all be okay with prideful agendas. Now, I don't know too much of the history here of CPC, but I might fancy a guess that a church that's been around for more than a month might at one point in time or another had one person who was really passionate about one thing, and that one thing became the orbit for everything else, or at least they thought that that's what everything else should be about. An agenda took over. This is how it has to be. This is what it must look like. Paul's like, let's put that to the back burner. I mean, still, in all honesty, it's an amazing exercise as a pastor to contemplate the way that you all worship. Thinking specifically of music, because there are churches all over our nation that are falling apart having this conversation because selfish agendas say it has to be, and then whatever you fill in the dots there. Or embrace true humility, the kind of humility that says, while I really wish we would have this ministry, we understand that we currently have the congregation that's gifted for another version of ministry. Embrace the kind of humility that allows a different, something other than your own agenda to be the priority. And lift your heads to extend love to others. And ultimately, that's just a don't be so focused on what you're doing in front of you that you miss what's going on around you. And then Paul gets more blunt. Get beyond yourself and protecting your own interest. Be sincere and secure your neighbor's interest first. I mean, this is where kind of all of this beautiful arrangement of what Jim had been talking about the last month comes to fruition. It kind of finds its head. Get beyond yourself and protecting your own interest. Be sincere and secure your neighbor's interest first. And this can be a very hard passage for you and I to hear, because the very real and relevant question is, who is my neighbor? Well, guess what? Jesus answers that one. And he answers it in the most fascinating of ways. He tells a story. There's a Samaritan. There's a guy who gets beat up and stripped, robbed, left for dead, naked on the side of the road. One kind of church guy passes by. The other kind of church guy passes by. The third one, the dirty outsider, is the one who helps them. And I ask you, which one is the neighbor? And at that point, we all take a big collective, that guy is the outsider. Well, that's the one whose interests you and I are supposed to be securing, not the one who's on our side. We're not making sure that the next version of us is better. We're looking to make sure that all get to experience the glory and beauty and grace that God would have for all of us. And Paul, as he can get wordy from time to time, also is brilliant at wrapping things up. Because Paul said, okay, so let me just tell you this then. In other words, adopt the mindset of Jesus. Okay, so if I knew you better, we'd make it really uncomfortable, and I'd ask you to tell me what the mindset of Jesus is. I mean, is there a single passage that we can go to say, here is the mindset of Christ? I mean, we, like in the church, we like to use language like, here's the heart of Christ, here's what Jesus desires, but we don't always have a uniform answer or understanding of what that looks like. It can be a challenge for us to understand exactly what is the mindset of Jesus, because while some might say it's welcoming the others, some might say it's elevating the lowly, it's reaching the margins, it's caring, it's reorienting. I mean, there are all sorts of thoughts as to the efficacy and what exactly did Christ do and how did Christ accomplish it. And that's why we're important together, because the way you've experienced it and the way you experience it is different. So as we communicate, if we can be open to one another and understanding the good and bigness of God, rather than having to defend my vantage point, it allows us to have this bigger experience of who Christ is. And then Paul ends with, live with this attitude in your heart. And there was this song going around, this hymn that was going around, kind of around this time, called the Christ hymn. But actually not sure what its origin was, but it was common and familiar enough that Paul, in the middle of his explanation, says, hey, you've all heard this song, right? Let me play the verse for you. And this is how Philippians 2:5 through the rest of 5 through 11 goes. Though he was in the form of God, he chose not to cling to equality with God, but he poured himself out to fill a vessel brand new, a servant in form and a man indeed, the very likeness of humanity. He humbled himself, obedient to death, a merciless death on the cross. So God raised him up to the highest place and gave him the name above all, so that when his name is called, every knee will bow in heaven, on earth, and below, and every tongue will confess Jesus, the Anointed One, is Lord, to the glory of God our Father. So you want to know what the mindset of God is? Let me sing this song for you that captures what God is doing. Let me sing this song for you about who Christ is and how Christ is active and at work in my life, in your life, and in our community. And I love the fact that it's a communion day. I mean, if I'm being honest, I wasn't, because there's a part as a fill-in pastor, you're like, who knows what's supposed to happen? And somebody's going to be upset because I picked the wrong thing up at the wrong time, and I'm going to apologize in advance. I've got notes. They told me kind of how. But I love the fact that it's communion day, because this is the place that you and I make the declaration that the thing that unites us is greater than anything that divides us. So there might be some people who have political leanings here that go one way, and some who go the other way. And just so there aren't shivers, eye rolls, or handfolds, we won't say the names of the candidates. But this table is bigger than any frustration, dislike, anger, or discord that those names create for us. You might have a team that you root for. You might have a family member who drives you bonkers. But this table is greater than any of those rifts and separations. That it's at this table that you and I get to say we are a community. We believe mystically. That's a fun word to use in a Presbyterian church in the Midwest on a Sunday morning. We believe something happens. And we say that because our Catholic brothers and sisters will say it becomes the host. And our Lutheran brothers and sisters will say it kind of becomes the host. And we're the next in line on that progression. We know it's bread and we know it's juice. But something about this moment in our community, when we do this at this time together, something more happens. We begin to say the one who is for us is greater than anything that is against us. And those things that might cause rifts and ripples, those things that we like to use to push others away and to keep those at an arm's length, this becomes a table that we start to say, nope, let's join together in this place. So friends, it's a beautiful experience for me as an outsider, or one who is standing on that line of becoming an insider, one who's familiar with community, to be able to say, this is a beautiful place where something is going to happen, something mystic. Something where we say, there are those that aren't with us, and even though they're not with us, somehow God is grafting them into this moment because of the way God is using CPC and our community to extend beyond. So I invite you to pray as we begin to prepare our hearts for the table.